Mike Tyson wasn't in the mood for conversation. It was too early, the airport was too crowded, and his flight was already delayed. He had his hoodie up, his bag next to him, and his mind set on getting through this trip without any unnecessary interactions. But airports had a way of bringing out the worst in people, especially the ones who thought a little too highly of their own opinions. It started as background noise. Some guy a few seats over, talking too loud, trying to sound like he knew everything about everything. Mike had tuned it out at first, just another voice in a sea of travelers complaining about delays and overpriced coffee. But then the guy's tone shifted. His voice got a little clearer. And his words? They were meant for Mike. Man, these old fighters, they wouldn't stand a chance today. Even the greats. Even Tyson. Mike sighed, not because he was angry, but because he already knew where this was going. The guy wasn't looking for a discussion. He was looking for a moment. And now, with a few cameras already turning in his direction, Mike had to decide how this moment was going to end. The airport was packed, filled with the usual mix of tired travelers, families juggling restless kids, business people lost in their laptops, and the occasional person who recognized him but wasn't sure whether to say something. Mike had his hoodie up, hands in his pockets, his bag resting against his leg. His flight had already been delayed twice, and now, as he stared at the massive departures board, he saw another update. Another delay. Great. He let out a slow breath, not annoyed, not angry, just resigned. Airports had a way of making time feel slower, like you were stuck in a loop with no real control. He shifted in his seat, adjusting the strap of his bag. All he wanted was to get through the day without any unnecessary interactions. But airports weren't always that kind. Airports had a way of making people forget themselves, a place where time didn't move the way it should, where delays turned into long, stretched out silences mixed with the constant hum of overhead announcements, the scraping of luggage wheels on polished floors, the quiet murmurs of exhausted travelers scrolling through their phones or shifting uncomfortably in stiff plastic chairs. Mike had been in places like this too many times before, waiting rooms, locker rooms, hotel lobbies, all these spaces where people were forced to exist together but rarely acknowledged one another. A strange kind of limbo where nobody really wanted to be, but everyone had to endure. He kept his head down, hood up, mind somewhere else, not thinking about much, just waiting for the inevitable update on the departures board, another delay, another hour spent in a place he had no control over. And that was fine, he wasn't in a rush. Some voices in a crowd naturally blended into the background, lost in the sea of conversations, but then there were the ones that cut through, voices that carried in a way that made you notice them even when you didn't want to, the kind of voices that weren't speaking just to talk, but to be heard. Mike wasn't paying attention at first, just another person talking too loud, maybe on the phone, maybe to whoever was unlucky enough to be sitting next to him, but something about the tone caught his ear. Not just the volume, but the confidence, the way the words were stretched out like statements instead of opinions, like facts instead of casual conversation. He didn't turn his head, didn't react, just let the words exist in the space between them, floating just loud enough to be impossible to ignore. Mike had heard it before, too many times to count, the same conversations replaying in different places, different faces saying the same things, always convinced that their perspective was the right one, that their analysis was sharp, that their opinions weren't just thoughts, but undeniable truths. The guy wasn't talking to him, not yet, but he was setting the stage, building the moment, and Mike had been around long enough to recognize it. He was the type who had probably read a few articles, watched a few highlight reels, maybe even hit the bag a couple of times at his local gym, just enough to convince himself that he understood the game, that he knew the sport, that he could look at a man like Mike Tyson and break him down like a name on a stat sheet instead of a fighter who had lived every inch of what it meant to step into that ring. Man, the sport's different now. That was the first clear sentence Mike caught, the kind of statement that was supposed to sound insightful, supposed to feel like wisdom, but Mike already knew where this was going before the guy even finished his thought. Fighters today are just built different. The old school guys wouldn't last in this era. Even the greats. Even Tyson. There it was. The name drop. The intentional pause afterward, the unspoken challenge in his tone, a fishing line cast into the air, waiting to see if he'd get a bite. Mike shifted slightly in his seat, exhaled slow and steady through his nose, not annoyed, not angry, just used to it. There was always someone like this, always a guy who wanted to make a point, to stir the pot, to say something bold and wait to see what would happen next. And the problem wasn't that he had an opinion, everyone did. It was the way he was saying it, the way he wanted it to be heard, the way he was waiting to see if it would land where he wanted it to. Mike had dealt with people like this before, in interviews, in restaurants, even in line at the grocery store, guys who needed a reaction, who needed to prove something, even if they didn't know what. It wasn't about Tyson himself, not really. It was about being the guy who said it, the guy who challenged the idea of greatness, the guy who thought he could poke at something bigger than himself and see if it would move. Mike didn't move, didn't react, but he could feel it happening, the way a few heads turned, the way people nearby started listening, the way someone a few seats down casually lifted their phone, not obviously, not like they were recording, but like they were preparing to, like they wanted to be ready just in case. This was how moments started, small at first, just a shift in the energy, but then it grew, spread, turned into something bigger than it should be, and the guy talking? He wasn't stupid. He knew it too. I mean, yeah, Tyson was great, but let's be real. If he stepped in the ring today, these younger guys would eat him alive. Mike still didn't look up, still didn't acknowledge it, but now the words weren't just being thrown into the air. Now they were being aimed. The guy had stopped talking to his friend, had angled his body slightly, just enough to let the words drift in Mike's direction, just enough to make sure there was no misunderstanding. He wanted this to be heard. He wanted a response. Someone, somewhere, was already recording. Mike didn't need to check to know. This was the age they lived in, where moments weren't just moments anymore, they were content, fuel for discussions that had nothing to do with what actually happened, headlines waiting to be written, and that was the part that made him more tired than anything else. It wasn't about truth. It wasn't about the sport. It was about who could capture a reaction first, about who could turn something small into something worth talking about, worth sharing, worth spreading. And Mike had a choice now, to give them what they wanted, or to let this play out the way it always did. Then, finally, it happened. The guy turned his head, eyes locking onto Mike's, his smile just a little too confident, just a little too pleased with himself. "You agree with that, champ?" The words came out slow, deliberate, each syllable stretched just enough to make it clear. This was the moment he had been building toward. Mike could feel it, the way the air in the terminal tightened just slightly, the way the background noise seemed to dip for a second, the way people who hadn't been paying attention were now suddenly listening. This was it. Mike lifted his head, slow, measured, finally letting his eyes meet the guy's, and in that instant, without saying a single word, everything shifted. The guy had been expecting something else, had been expecting an argument, a laugh, a dismissive shake of the head, maybe even a comment that he could bounce off of, turn into something bigger. But all he got was silence. A look. A moment where he realized, too late, that he might have just made himself the most uncomfortable person in the room. Mike had been here before. Not this airport, not this exact chair, but in this moment, the moment where someone thought they had an opportunity, where they saw his presence as an invitation, where they convinced themselves that their words held enough weight to matter. It was always the same, whether it was in a restaurant, a gym, or a lobby, some guy who had been waiting for the right conditions to say something just loud enough, just confidently enough, just carelessly enough to make sure it landed exactly where he wanted it to. Mike didn't need to turn his head to know the guy was watching him now, waiting to see if he would react, waiting to see if he would give him the moment he was hoping for. People like this rarely said things directly, not at first. They needed a little space between them and the moment, a little room to feel safe in their opinions, to speak like they were just making conversation, just talking about the sport, just saying what they thought. But the moment Mike was in the room, that space started closing, that confidence started shifting, because now it wasn't just talk, it was talk with an audience, talk with the risk of being challenged. Talk that had to stand on its own without the safety of anonymity. The guy was still leaning back, still casual, still playing it like this was just another opinion. But now, after letting the words sit for just long enough, after making sure he had enough people listening, he was ready to close the distance. "You agree with that, champ?" There it was. The moment. The shift from just talking to making it personal. The tone was light, playful even, but the intent was clear. He wanted something. Maybe just a reaction, maybe a conversation, maybe a chance to be able to say that he had debated Tyson himself in an airport terminal. Mike could hear the small rustling of people shifting in their seats, the quiet anticipation from the ones who had been watching this unfold, the subtle pause and the background noise as the space around them contracted, as the moment became something that couldn't be ignored anymore. Mike had been in real fights before, not the ones people talked about in places like this, not the ones debated over sports shows or social media arguments, but real ones, where words didn't hold weight, where it wasn't about opinions, but survival. And that's why he knew the guy wasn't really asking if he agreed. He was asking for permission. Permission to keep going, permission to push a little further, permission to see how far he could take this before it became something real. Mike had learned, over years, over experience, over a lifetime of moments like these, that the loudest thing you could say was sometimes nothing at all. He let the silence stretch just long enough, let the guy feel the weight of it, let him sit in the discomfort of his own words without giving him an escape. The guy shifted slightly, just a small adjustment in his posture, just enough to show that he felt it too. That pause, that waiting, that realization that he wasn't in control of the moment the way he thought he was, that was the first real shift. When Mike finally did look up, it wasn't rushed, wasn't reactive, wasn't done to meet aggression with aggression. It was slow, deliberate, measured. The kind of look that wasn't just acknowledging someone's presence, but forcing them to recognize their own. The guy had been smiling a second ago, had been leaning into the conversation like he was in charge of it, like he was guiding it, but now, faced with the reality of being seen, that confidence cracked. Just slightly, just enough for Mike to notice. Mike didn't need to say anything for the room to react. He could feel it happening, the way people were suddenly more aware of the space between them, the way the air changed when attention was no longer on the man talking but on the man listening. The way people adjusted, leaned in just a little, waited for something to happen. The guy wasn't smiling anymore. He wasn't backing down either, not yet, but there was something different in his face now, something hesitant, something that hadn't been there before. Mike didn't argue. Didn't defend himself. Didn't explain why he didn't need to. He just let the guy realize, in real time, that the moment he had built, the one he had been so confident in, was no longer his. That he had set something in motion that he couldn't control anymore. That he wasn't talking to a highlight reel or a documentary or a myth, he was talking to a man. And the worst part? That man wasn't giving him what he wanted. The guy tried to recover, tried to shift the energy back, tried to make it light again, throwing out something like, "Hey, no disrespect, man, just saying, times change." But it didn't land the way he wanted it to. It felt forced now, like an excuse, like a way to step back without admitting he was stepping back. Mike didn't nod. Didn't acknowledge it. Didn't let him off the hook. He just let the guy sit in it. Let him feel what it meant to start something and then realize too late that he wasn't ready to finish it. The flight announcement came over the speakers. Boarding. Mike stood up, grabbed his bag, didn't rush, didn't make it dramatic, just moved the way he always did, calm, steady, unaffected. The guy didn't say anything else. Didn't try to follow up. Didn't try to win back what he had already lost. He just watched as Mike walked past, as the moment ended not with a confrontation, not with an explosion, but with the quiet realization that some fights don't need fists. Some fights? You win just by letting the other person sit with their own words. Mike had been in too many moments like this before, had sat through too many conversations that weren't really conversations, had watched too many people talk just to hear their own voices, waiting for a reaction they thought they wanted but weren't ready to handle. The man sitting 2 seats over had walked himself right into that space, had started something he didn't realize he had no control over, and now, as he shifted in his seat just slightly, As his smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, Mike knew that the real fight had already begun, not in fists, not in words, but in silence, in the power of making someone sit in their own moment and realize, too late, that they weren't prepared for what came next. The energy in the terminal had shifted, not in an obvious way, not in a way that would make someone walking by stop in their tracks, but in that subtle, electric way that made people instinctively tune in, like they could feel something happening without knowing exactly why. It was in the way the nearby conversations had started to quiet, and the way the people who had been scrolling through their phones suddenly seemed more interested in what was happening around them, in the way the man who had been so comfortable speaking just minutes ago now found himself sitting under a gaze he hadn't expected to meet. Because it was one thing to talk about Mike Tyson when he wasn't listening, but it was another thing entirely to realize he was looking right at you. There was always a delay, always a few seconds where a person still believed they were in control, still thought they could dictate the way things would play out, still held onto the idea that they had the upper hand. The man was sitting in that delay now, his posture still relaxed, his expression still neutral, but Mike could see it, the shift in his breathing, the way he licked his lips just slightly before speaking again, the way his fingers tapped against the armrest like he was trying to ground himself without making it obvious. He wasn't panicking. Not yet. But he was thinking. And that was all Mike needed. The guy cleared his throat, forced a casual chuckle, the kind of sound people made when they wanted to smooth over a moment, to pull it back to something comfortable, something safe. "Hey, man," he said, leaning back slightly, as if trying to regain some of the space he had lost. "No disrespect. Just talking, you know? Just a conversation." It was a lifeline, an attempt to reset, to shift the energy back in his favor. But Mike didn't let it happen. He didn't nod. Didn't smile. Didn't acknowledge the attempt to make it small. Because it wasn't small. It never was. Mike had spent years learning how to read people, years understanding that the way a person said something mattered just as much as what they said. He had seen this before, had watched men step into the ring with confidence that cracked the moment they realized they were in over their heads, had seen the slow unraveling of certainty when faced with something they couldn't control. And that was what was happening now. The guy wasn't backing down, not outright, but the hesitation was there, the awareness creeping in, the slow understanding that he had pushed something he didn't fully understand. And the worst part? He knew that everyone around him could see it too. The guy shifted again, crossed his arms, then uncrossed them, trying to find a comfortable position, trying to act like he wasn't feeling the shift in the air, but it was too late. He had started this for attention, had wanted a moment, had built up the idea that he was saying something bold, something worth hearing, but now he was just sitting in it, with nothing left to add, with no way to reclaim what he had already lost. And Mike? Mike wasn't doing anything. Wasn't arguing. Wasn't debating. Wasn't even looking away. And that was the part that made it worse. People weren't staring outright, but they were paying attention. That was how these moments worked. Nobody wanted to look too obvious, nobody wanted to be caught watching, but Mike could feel it, the way the space had shrunk, the way the people nearby were suddenly quieter, more aware, waiting for something to happen. It wasn't about entertainment, not really. It was about tension, about that feeling in the air when something is on the verge of turning into something else, when people can sense that the balance of power in a conversation has shifted in a way that can't be ignored. The man wasn't going to admit he had lost. He wasn't going to get up and walk away, wasn't going to acknowledge that this hadn't gone the way he wanted it to. Instead, he did what people always did when they realized they had miscalculated. He pretended it didn't matter. "Anyway," he muttered, shifting in his seat, pulling out his phone like he suddenly had something important to look at, like he hadn't just spent the last 5 minutes trying to create a moment that had collapsed under its own weight. It was a silent retreat, the kind that didn't come with an apology but was an apology all the same. The speakers crackled overhead, a boarding announcement rolling through the terminal, breaking the silence, giving the man an out that he hadn't earned but would gladly take. Mike didn't move right away, didn't rush to grab his bag, didn't acknowledge the shift, because he didn't need to. The guy, on the other hand, moved too quickly, stood up like he had been waiting for an excuse, like he had something more important to do, something urgent, something that required his attention anywhere but here. Mike stood up slowly, stretched his shoulders, grabbed his bag, didn't glance back, didn't give the guy another second of his time. There was no need. He had won, not with words, not with aggression, but with presence, with the simple act of letting someone sit in their own moment and realize, on their own, that they had been the only one who made it weird. And that was the thing about fights, some of them didn't need fists. Some of them were over before they even started. The moment after a direct question was always the most telling, not because of the answer itself, but because of everything that happened in the space before it, the way a person adjusted in their seat, the way their breath changed, the way their confidence either held steady or began to shift under the weight of their own words. Mike had learned a long time ago that silence could do more damage than any punch, that letting a person hear the echo of their own voice without interruption made them realize, sometimes too late, that they might have said too much. He didn't rush to fill the space, didn't shift in his seat, didn't break eye contact, didn't even adjust his posture. He just let the words sit there, untouched, waiting for the man to realize that he had put himself in a position he didn't actually want to be in. The airport around them hadn't stopped moving, flights were still being called, conversations still hummed in the background, people still dragged their luggage toward security lines. But within this small section of the terminal, something had changed, something subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that people noticed without realizing why. The people closest to them had stopped pretending they weren't listening, had started stealing quick glances, had begun adjusting their body language like they were preparing for something, but nobody said a word. Nobody wanted to be the first to react, because when something like this happened, when the energy in a space changed so completely, so unexpectedly, nobody wanted to risk moving before they knew which way it was going to go. Mike could see it happening in real time, the way the man, who had been so confident just a moment ago, was now realizing that he had expected a different kind of response, that he had thought this would go another way, that he had assumed a legend like Tyson would either brush him off with a joke or argue back with the kind of bravado that would give him exactly what he wanted. But he hadn't gotten either, and now he was stuck in the middle of his own making, stuck in a conversation that had shifted from something he controlled to something he was trying to navigate, stuck with eyes on him when all he had wanted was eyes on Mike. And that was the thing about moments like this, once a person lost control of them, there was no getting it back. He cleared his throat, a small sound, almost insignificant, but Mike caught it, recognized it for what it was, the first sign of an internal recalibration. The first sign that the man was realizing he had made a mistake but hadn't yet figured out how to fix it. He leaned back slightly, tried to force an easygoing smile, the kind of expression that said, "I was just messing around," the kind of expression that would have worked if it had come 5 seconds earlier, before the shift, before the silence, before he had become aware of the fact that people were waiting, watching, waiting for something to happen, waiting to see if he could pull himself out of this the way he had thought he could when he first started talking. "Hey, man, no disrespect," he said, and the way he said it told Mike everything he needed to know. The words were meant to sound casual, dismissive, like this was nothing, like this was just another harmless conversation between two guys killing time in an airport, but they weren't. They were a retreat, a last-minute attempt to lighten something that had already settled too deep, a way to rewrite the moment before it could be solidified in his memory, in the memory of the people around them, in the memory of the phones that were, undoubtedly, already recording. Mike had seen it before, the way people tried to talk their way out of things they never should have walked into, the way they backpedaled without moving, the way they tried to reframe reality when they realized too late that they had underestimated the weight of it. Mike didn't nod, didn't acknowledge the backpedal, didn't reward the attempt to rewrite the moment. He just kept watching, his face unreadable, his expression unchanged, because he knew, and now the guy knew too, that an apology made without real acknowledgement wasn't an apology at all. And that was the part that people like him never understood, the part they always got wrong, the part that made moments like this feel so much bigger than just words. It wasn't about what was said. It was about what wasn't. It was about how a person reacted when they realized that they had miscalculated, that they had stepped into something heavier than they had expected, that they had spoken into a silence that wasn't giving anything back. The speakers crackled overhead, a boarding announcement rolling through the air. breaking the tension just enough to let people breathe again, to let the guy shift in his seat like he had just been given a way out, a door he could step through without having to acknowledge what had just happened. Mike knew he would take it. He always did. People like him always did. Because the thing about these moments, the thing about starting something and then realizing too late that it had become something else entirely, was that once a person found an escape, they took it, even if it meant pretending none of it had ever happened in the first place. The man let out a quick breath, too forced to be natural, like he was trying to shake something off, like he was trying to reset himself. He reached for his bag, adjusted his watch, looked at his phone as if it had just buzzed even though Mike knew it hadn't. Small movements, small distractions, small attempts to regain control of a moment that had already slipped too far away. He didn't look at Mike again. He didn't say anything else. He just picked up his things and stood, not too quickly, not in a way that would make it obvious, but in a way that was supposed to make it look like this had been his decision all along, like he had somewhere else to be. Like this had never been anything to begin with. Mike didn't watch him go, didn't track his movement, didn't give him the satisfaction of knowing he was paying attention, because the truth was, he wasn't. The moment was over. The conversation was over. There was nothing left to take from it. The guy would walk away, would blend back into the sea of travelers, would get on his flight and pretend this had never happened, would tell the story later in a way that made himself look better. That made it seem like he had been the one in control. And maybe the people listening to him would believe it. But the people who had been here? The people who had felt the energy shift? They knew. Mike grabbed his bag, stood up slowly, rolled his shoulders back, didn't look at the cameras that had undoubtedly captured every second of what had just happened. Some fights didn't need fists. Some fights were over before they even started. And the best victories? The ones that stayed with a person long after they had convinced themselves they had moved on? Those were the ones where you didn't have to do anything at all. Mike didn't rush to leave, didn't act like anything had happened at all. He stood up slowly, adjusting the strap of his bag, letting the moment fade exactly the way it was supposed to, not with a big confrontation, not with a final word, but with the simple act of moving on. The man who had started it all was gone now, disappeared into the crowd, trying to blend in as if this moment hadn't shifted something in him, as if he wasn't still thinking about it even as he walked away. Mike had seen it before, people convincing themselves they were unaffected, when deep down, they were replaying everything in their heads, realizing too late that they had lost a fight they didn't even know they were in. As Mike walked toward his gate, he could still feel a few lingering eyes on him, a few people who had been watching, who had understood what had just happened even if they couldn't put it into words. This wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about letting someone sit with their own words long enough to realize they didn't need to be said in the first place. And that was the thing about moments like this, they didn't fade as quickly as people thought they would. The guy was gone, his seat empty now, but Mike knew the truth. The real conversation? The real lesson? It wasn't over. It was just beginning. And it wasn't for him. It was for the man who had walked away.